everyone, and welcome to this afternoon's Institute for Government webinar, which is taking place just a few hours after Rishi Sunak launched the Conservative Party Manifesto. I'm Hannah White, I'm Director of the Institute for Government. So the Prime Minister was at the Silverstone racetrack, which inevitably leads to headlines about putting your foot on the accelerator, crashing the economy, driving in circles, going full speed ahead. Take your pick, what particular metaphor you choose to use. I'm sure the papers will be full of them tomorrow. But this webinar is going to be getting into the details of what we heard today. A big day, as manifesto launches always are in the general election campaign. And I'm delighted to say I'm here with a top trio of IfG colleagues, Senior Fellow Giles Wilkes, Senior Fellow Joe Rutter, and Nick Davies, who heads our work on public services. And over the next 45 minutes or so, we will look at the promises and the pledges, whether the plans add up, and what they would mean for government. So please do send in your questions. We've got some great ones coming through already, I can see on Slido, and I will try to get to as many of them as possible. But first of all, I'm going to start with some questions of my own. Giles, just a small one for you. Tax. Tax is at the heart of this manifesto, about £17 billion worth, I think, of tax cuts. So give us your sort of quickfire assessment. How are these being paid for, and do they add up?
Well, I think they're being paid for by a £12 billion welfare cut, and I think public sector efficiencies and clamping down on tax avoidance are the magic ways. So they haven't explicitly said to any particular department, apart from the welfare department, that they're cutting things. They're just saying we're going to run the ship a bit tighter. Now, a lot of people will recognise that 12 billion welfare figure from the 2015 election, almost 10 years ago, which George Osborne promised. And it seemed to fall to pieces within a few months as he had suffered a parliamentary defeat on the early stages. But people have pointed out that over time, by being very, very mean in terms of raising the rate at which you lift benefits with inflation, they did manage to get that 12 billion figure. So you might say it's realistic over a very long term, although people in the receipt of welfare might say that's just, you know, realistic for you means a cost of living crisis for me, and it's much harder to cut from a lower level. But the other point I would make, and I think Nick will be able to expand on this a lot more, we started this manifesto process before we knew anything. The general assumption of people here at the IfG and at other places like the Institute for Fiscal Studies is that the public realm needs more money just to hang together. 20 billion, 30 billion pounds minimum. In other words, a really realistic manifesto, if it wants to promise anything, needs to start with tax rises, not tax cuts. So any tax cuts, you might say, are unaffordable because the demands of public spending will come around, as they did for previous governments, Conservative governments, that promised tax cuts. So you might say it's not at all realistic, because even if you could find savings in the welfare bill or find ways of getting people back to work or other great virtuous policies, the demands of the defence budget, the social care budget, underwater local authorities, university system, the railway system, all of these things might demand it first.
Okay, well, Nick, that seems like a pretty obvious segue into your expertise. How do these pledges, which the Prime Minister has made, compare to that scale of the challenge facing the public services that Giles has mentioned there? To what extent would you say that even the current spending plans, before you get into further tax cuts, are deliverable?
So on current spending plans, the figures set out from April 2025 onwards were always going to be extremely difficult to deliver. So overall spending is penciled in to rise by about 1% in real terms. But when you take account of pledges on defence, aid, the NHS and childcare, it means that spending on unprotected areas of public spending, like criminal justice, for example, would be set to fall by about 3% per capita in real terms in each year. And given the scale of the challenges facing public services, that's going to be very difficult to deliver. It would be if implemented, it would be the tightest spending review since 2015, which governments since have found impossible to deliver. They've tried to stick to those tight spending plans, but because of poor public service performance, they found it necessary to constantly pump in new money, which is just a really inefficient way of funding public services.
Okay, Jill, give us the political kind of lens here then. What is it that Sunak is betting on? Is he essentially hoping that in the end, every voter demographic is going to think ultimately that tax cuts are something that they can't resist?
Well, clearly he's not offering very much for people on welfare who are going to be the target of those big cuts that Giles was just outlining. But he's got something for employees with the promise to halve national insurance contributions. So basically he's taking another sort of cut there. So, and that's where the big money goes. That's actually, by 2029-30 going to cost 10 billion. He's made a more radical proposal for the self-employed, which is very interesting because some people might remember that Philip Hammond as Chancellor tried to bring self-employed treatment for national insurance back in line with employees, and that was lauded by all the advocates of fiscal neutrality. But clearly Rishi Sunak isn't persuaded by that because he's proposing to abolish that. So that goes entirely at the cost of another 2.6 billion. Then he's got the thing for pensioners. The thing for pensioners, you'll remember that when the Chancellor's taken down national insurance before, pensions will squeak, there's nothing for us, because if you're overstate pension age, even if you're working, you don't pay national insurance, so you can't benefit by definition from a tax cut. So we've got that much trail triple lock, which basically says we'll sort of insulate you against the effects of my freeze in tax allowances that everybody else is having. Something for families, well, families who are relatively well off, with that higher income child benefit charge being hiked up quite a long way, so it'll only kick in at 120,000. Something for first-time buyers, and something on a very, very minor measure on CGT. So he's sort of going around trying to sort of say you can all share in this tax cutting bonanza. The only problem for him is, of course, if those people are saying, well, I don't mind having my taxes cut, but actually I'm really worried about the state of the NHS or the state of schools or roads or whatever.
And sticking with you, Jill, the Prime Minister's been keen to cast this as an election about the future, about his new pledges, but Labour has been keen to say that voters should be making their decision on the basis of the government's record. If we look back at the flagship policies which were in the last Conservative manifesto, getting Brexit done, delivering levelling up, how would you rate the government's efforts on either of those?
Well, somebody I think on Twitter had just been through and counted the number of Brexit mentions, which is 12, and all in quite minor context. So Brexit is very much a background mention here. It pops up the odd time when we mention that we've taken a Brexit opportunity, or that we can do something very minor, which is another Brexit opportunity, but it really is not majored. I mean, the Conservatives don't celebrate this as the big achievement of the last Parliament. You could imagine they might have started with we told you we get Brexit done, we got Brexit done. They're downplaying that massively. There are bits where the Prime Minister is lauding little bits of tweaking he can do, but very, very little. Levelling up is a sort of rather unenthusiastic nod, slightly by sufferance. So you can tell, I think, that is not a particular passion of the Prime Minister. He sort of mentions the Shared Prosperity Fund, but says that'll run for another 3 years, and then it's going to be redirected to support his national service. The one bit he is quite enthusiastic about, gets another shout out with the promise of more free ports, which was a sort of very early Rishi Sunak idea. I think he trailed that, and that's maybe his contribution to the policy debate. So I think this is very much an agenda which doesn't have particular Prime Minister imprimatur, and we're actually seeing quite a similar thing. I'm going to bring in another area that you might not want me to mention, which is net zero, which I think is another interesting area where the Prime Minister really is showing that, unlike his predecessor, unlike Boris Johnson, who wrote the 2019 manifesto, or at least put his thumbprint on it, it's not really the Prime Minister's agenda. the first mention in that section is about North Sea oil licensing. And the big mention there is they're not going to do the sort of top-down dogmatic approach that you would see from the Labour Party. So a big emphasis on being very, very conscious of the need to not to put households' bills up and to make this transition sort of easy on them. And the Prime Minister may have looked actually at the results of those European Parliament elections over the weekend, where there's quite clear evidence of sort of green lash in a lot of European countries. So you might think he's actually getting the zeitgeist righter there than Ed Miliband and Keir Starmer.
Nick, I think you wanted to come back in on the question I asked you before about public services, just in terms of to what extent the new pledges from the government are going to address the scale of the challenges that face them.
Yes, absolutely. So, I mean, I think most of the headline policies are recommitment to existing government policies. So, 30 hours of free childcare a week from the age of 9 months, delivering the NHS long-term workforce plan and the big increase in doctors and nurses that involves, combining A-levels and T-levels into a new advanced British standard qualification. But I think it's notable that some of the biggest challenges facing public services aren't really addressed at all. So there's nothing on, making it easier for people to see their GPs, nothing on the fact that, lots of local authorities are on the edge of bankruptcy, nothing on the fact that the children's residential care market is completely broken, very little recognition of the fact that prisons are already full, but all of the criminal justice policies in the manifesto would likely lead to more charges. Similarly, little recognition that court backlogs are already at record levels and are continuing to grow. It talks about productivity in the NHS and the kind of wider public sector, but it's kind of very superficial and doesn't suggest a kind of deep understanding of the drivers of it. And on social care, it's the same promises that have already been delayed multiple times over the last decade. I recognise that when you've been in power for 14 years, it's quite difficult to point out the problems that you've overseen, but the lack of answers is notable nonetheless.
Thanks, Nick. Giles, coming back to you and returning to the subject of previous commitments that the government's made, whether they have been fulfilled. One of Rishi Sunak's 5 pledges was to grow the economy. Has he set out a plan in this manifesto to achieve that? And if he has, then why, given that he has been Prime Minister, has he not deployed that plan already?
Well, I'm going to start with the most generous possible interpretation of it. What I believe Rishi Sunak would like everyone to see this, characterize this problem as, look at how bad things looked when I took over. And if you took all the forecasts from autumn 2022, when gas prices went to be really high, we weren't sure how high interest rates were going to go. Inflation still seemed out of control. Chaos, chaos, chaos. And since then, the threatened quite nasty recession we might have had didn't really happen. We had what they call a technical recession, but unemployment doesn't seem to have gone up at all. And inflation has now been dealt with as it is normally. And he'd say, look, things are back on an even keel. Now, I mean, those of us who watch the economy closely would say, well, that was because gas prices fell, which was nothing to do with you. And the Bank of England deals with inflation, not you. And in the meantime, if you look at the forecast for this economy and the forecast that really matters, the underlying speed rate, it's just not very good. Even when we were coming out of the recession, when they describe in their manifesto that the economy was in tatters in 2010, it was nevertheless forecast to grow at something like sort of 12% in 5 years and ended up doing, maybe 9.5%. And now it's expected to do only sort of 7 or 8%. And, that's really poor given how much we're meant to be able to catch up from COVID. So has he got plans to deal with this? Well, it's frustrating going through the manifesto because every time you find something that might be good, you also see in the next paragraph something that you probably think is bad. So I'll again start with the positive stuff. If you are going to cut taxes, cutting national insurance is good for employment. And the OBR has formally scored this before, that a 2p cut maybe boosts people's incentive to work and brings like 90,000 people out into the workforce. That's 0.2, 0.3% of the economy. It's not bad. What else have I got a big uptick against here? Well, he wants to boost apprenticeships, but I'm not sure he's quite shown why. He's going after stamp duty, which is a bad tax. I mean, a really ambitious government would try to reform the whole thing, abolish it and raise land taxes or something to do it, but he doesn't have that kind of a scope. He wants to carry on boosting infrastructure, including cities outside of London. That's a reasonably good idea. But he's still keeping with some of the industrial strategy ideas that are actually championed by his chancellor more than him. A good advanced manufacturing plan that everybody does like in industry, and is actually gets very little mention by Conservatives because they don't like using the phrase industrial strategy. But for all of those positives, there's quite a lot of negatives, like giving people more incentive to be self-employed is a great way of making the economy less efficient. I mean, the normal rule in politics is you go into the business department, you start singing hymns to the backbone of the economy, the lifeblood, which is small businesses. But the more efficient economies know how to grow out of small businesses and the big ones, and raising the VAT threshold so there's even more incentive to be small isn't a good policy. Making it better to be self-employed isn't a good policy. The cap on migration, the legal cap, that's probably going to be a disaster if it ever came in. I mean, it's very hard to see how such an important thing as the labour market could put up with such a bad intervention. I mean, going against things that economists like road pricing. He's meant to be the technocrat who believes in this stuff. If you've got a congestion issue and we've got falling road fuel duties coming, road pricing is the way to go. And actually, ULEZ is probably saving people's lives in London. So going against that just doesn't seem like good politics, and it's not particularly good for the economy. So... And I think going after net zero as well. I mean, net zero is the investment challenge of the future. Tying your hands as to how you do it. You might say, it's actually a real burden to do it. It's going to be a real challenge. But tying your hands in advance and making it a political thing is growth negative, full stop. And so I would say, unfortunately, there's possibly more negative for growth than positive in here.
Hannah, I do think that ruling out road pricing is possibly the most irresponsible thing that the Prime Minister has done in this manifesto, because we know that the Treasury is going to have to find a replacement for fuel duty with the switch to electric vehicles. That raises just short of £30 billion for the public finances. You need some sort of, every year you need some sort of replacement for it. And I think, Conservative think tank after Conservative think tank have suggested road pricing. That's the obvious place to go. And to have a blanket ruling it out is, and possibly then, the worst of all worlds is if we end up with some dynamic where in an interview with Keir Starmer or Rachel Reeves, they're asked to rule it out as well, and they feel obliged to do it. I mean, the Prime Minister is putting himself, against sort of sensible tax reform. He's also ruled out any changes on council tax, which is a massively aged tax. We've had review after review saying, really we need to overhaul the way we tax property. So any tax reform that could improve the working of the economy, he seems to be dead set against. And I think that really is a big negative from this manifesto.
Thanks, Joel. Joel, back to you. We're talking today about the Conservative manifesto, but we have heard from all the parties really about how the money that they're going to spend on the new things they want to do is going to come from tackling tax avoidance. And they all come up with different figures for how much they can generate from this. The Conservative manifesto suggests it will generate savings of £6 billion a year by the end of the Parliament. How likely do you think it is that savings of this scale can be found? And once again, if they're there to be found, why haven't we been finding them already?
I do think that last point is the really important one. That there is really serious work that tax authorities can do to go after tax avoidance. And there's important international agreements going on under the aegis of the OECD, something called the Base Erosion and Profit Shifting Project, which is really revolutionary. It's trying to get governments across the world to stop competing against one another in a way that just helps the tax avoiders. So there is valuable work to be done there. The trouble is, it is a game of cat and mouse, and if you close one loophole, the tax accountants get to work and find another one. So I believe that after a few years, they start assuming that it erodes away again. I'm not an absolute expert in it. All I know is this sort of thing, a Conservative with a small c approach would be not to sort of spend it until you've got it. It'd be great if we could. But I think the really Conservative thing to do is to say, look, we're always going to be trying to go after tax avoidance for the reason you just given. Why would you not save it up for an election? And then when you get it, announce it, prove it, and then spend it, rather than spending it in advance and then finding it doesn't turn up.
I guess it just demonstrates how little additional money there is to be found for all the parties at this point ahead of the election. Jill, one of the other ways in which the Conservative Party say they're going to fund their plans is through cuts to civil service staff numbers and general efficiencies. Savings, they say, will be found of £1 billion a year in terms of arm's length bodies by the end of the Parliament. Again, do you think this sounds feasible?
Well, you can take civil service numbers down. The government's said it would do that, but sort of failed. They keep going up, partly because the Prime Minister finds more things for them to do. And I think one of the things that's very striking about this document is how busy it is. I mean, every chapter starts with our plan for this, our plan for that. There's a lot of government activity and intervention going on. And that's one of the things that drives civil service numbers. What it's not really doing is setting out a huge big plan for where the government's going to withdraw or stop doing things, which actually is the real route to bring down numbers significantly. So I think it's let's say at best a question mark over that. The key thing about saving money out of arm's length bodies, and they spend a lot of money though, is that it's not really in the overhead that you have scope for making big savings. It's from cutting their big programs, so cutting the amounts that you're channeling through arm's length bodies. So it'd be interesting to see if ministers really have the stomach to do that and what they're including in that 1 billion. So, at the end of the day, 1 billion isn't vast amounts, but it's not vast amounts from either side of the table. So we will have to do that. But one of the things to bear in mind, and this is, I think, relevant to some things the Prime Minister set out as possible Brexit opportunities, is if you talk to some of the UK's regulators, they will say that there are backlogs in the approval of medicines. That's supposed to be one of the big opportunities around life sciences. But we can't get approvals through as quickly as people in the EU, the European Medicines Agencies. The Food Standards Agency are suffering because they don't have enough people. So there are big backlogs on approving novel foods and things like that. So actually, in those arm's length bodies at the moment, there are some quite big gaps in staffing, which are making them less effective and meaning that they can't take some of the potential opportunities from regulating better they might have been. So it may be a bit of a false economy.
Well, Nick, moving smoothly on, thanks, Jill, to false economies in terms of staffing, and let's look at public services. We know there are serious staffing issues in public services, and the Conservative Manifesto makes a number of commitments in relation to this. It says a new Conservative government would commit to the NHS long-term workforce plan, something that we think is generally a good thing, but it also pledges to cut NHS managers by 5,500 to free up resources for frontline services. In the police service, the Conservatives are saying that they would add 8,000 more police officers to the workforce. Are these, in your view, the right answers to the workforce challenges that public services are facing?
So on the NHS long-term workforce plan, it was long called for, including by the Institute. It was extremely welcome when it was announced, and both main parties are committed to it. But I think there are big questions about how deliverable it is in terms of, do we have enough training spaces for that many new doctors and nurses? Do we have the people with the capacity needed to train them? And it's also, delivering it is really expensive. So it's estimated to imply increasing NHS spending by about 3.6% per year in real terms. And because we spend so much on the NHS, that has big implications for other bits of public spending and on tax policy as well. So it's a question of how affordable it is. On the kind of pledge to add 8,000 more police officers, that was probably the most notable new thing that's in the manifesto. It obviously echoes the pledge that was in the 2019 manifesto to increase the number of officers by 20,000, which the government has successfully done over the past few years. But the big question is about the impact that that has downstream in the criminal justice system. As I said, we have courts that are already with the biggest backlogs in history. Prisons are quite literally full, and they definitely, neither of them have the capacity to deal with the extra people that you would expect to be generated from more officers making more charges. I think across both those pledges, and although this is electorally understandable, there is a focus on the kind of high-profile frontline staff like doctors, nurses, and police officers. But that is definitely not the best way or the most productive or the most efficient way to invest in those services. On NHS managers, we've already had a huge reduction in the number of NHS managers since 2010. And compared to other countries and the private sector, the NHS is, chronically undermanaged. And that lack of management capacity and the ability to kind of effectively allocate resources is one of the reasons why we have big productivity problems, particularly in hospitals. And cutting them further is only going to make the situation worse. I think with the police officers, so the current requirement to maintain police officer numbers at the new raised level, despite having quite tight budgets, has had some really perverse incentives. So it's led to forces actually cutting their number of specialist staff and filling those posts with more expensive warranted officers. And so if you increase the number of officers even further, that's likely to put even greater pressure on the number of actually pretty efficient and good at their jobs staff who are in many ways easier to recruit and certainly easier to train than officers. The Conservatives, talk a lot in their manifesto about public sector productivity, but, overall, I think these proposals are likely to make things worse.
And I just want to start bringing in some of the questions we're getting through on Slido, Nick, just to follow up on that to you. And do, by the way, keep sending in your questions. We've got lots coming through. I've got one from Martin Wheatcroft, who asks about whether the government, whether Rishi Sunak is double counting how he is going to spend the efficiencies that he says he's going to find. He says that that is how he's going to deal with the cuts that would fall in unprotected budgets, but that he has other spending plans which also appear to be being funded by efficiencies. So he says, is he double counting, or are there plenty of efficiencies to go round, Nick?
So I haven't looked in detail at the figures. He may well be double counting. I think the bigger issue is the one that Giles pointed out, that all governments talk about finding efficiency savings, but find it much harder to deliver them in reality. I think that the tricky thing is that there are efficiencies that can be found in public services, but those efficiencies are not going to be found by kind of salami slicing different bits of those services, and it's certainly not by kind of cutting the managerial capacity. Actually, a lot of the efficiency savings that would be found are going to be found by frontline services, redesigning how that service is delivered, making kind of small investments in kind of, new equipment, collaborating more with other local services. But that's really difficult to direct from the centre of government and Whitehall more generally. And actually, I think probably the best way of unleashing a lot of those productivity and improvements and efficiency savings is by giving frontline services greater freedom. At the moment, they are very hamstrung by having to spend their money in there's a lot of small pots of money that are ring-fenced that makes it really hard to invest. They're for kind of short periods of time, so you can't plan for years ahead, and that makes it, and a lot of policy is really prescribed from the centre of government. And so although government tries to incentivize efficiencies, often it's just making it harder for those on the front line to do that, and they're the ones that are most likely to realise those efficiencies.
Giles, carrying on with this question of find efficiencies, and another question, this is an anonymous question that's come through on Slido. Anonymous asks you, Giles, Is there too much reliance in the manifesto on the use of AI and digital solutions to deliver public sector efficiencies, especially whilst reducing civil service numbers? Is that realistic?
Can I tell you the most wonderful coincidence, which was during when Jill was talking, I decided to Google the use of AI in the manifesto. I found that once the phrase artificial intelligence had been introduced and AI took over, it was only used 6 times and not really relied on. I mean, they're saying we're going to increase investment in it, and they have quite a laudable concern with AI safety, this government, and they've really pushed that agenda with the AI summit. But I don't think they're saying, and then introduce AI and bang, suddenly you can get rid of a load of civil servants, which, some of the more people at the more optimistic end really do think that. They see what civil service do as pure admin and wordplay, and the one thing that we know AI can do is mess around with words. But I don't think they're relying on that. I don't really know what they are relying on. And I do think actually it's one of the really good uses of AI. It's just going to take a lot of time. As I heard a really smart person from a left-wing think tank say, this is about business process management as much as AI. It doesn't matter how clever it is, you've got to manage some really complicated business processes and some humans to do it well. And that just doesn't switch on like a light.
Nick, you want to come in?
Yes, look, I think there definitely are things that AI could help with for public services in the future, but in many cases that will rely on much better quality data than those services currently have. And frankly, the easier wins are going to be from investing in much more basic technology. Issues like doctors and nurses getting in the morning and it taking half an hour for their laptop to turn on, or not being able to kind of share data with colleagues working in other organizations within the NHS. So yes, there are kind of tech improvements, but I would be looking other places before I was looking at AI.
Jill, I don't think we can conclude a discussion of the Conservative manifesto without having a discussion about immigration. The manifesto reaffirms the government's commitment to push on with the Rwanda plan in an attempt to bring down illegal migration, but also to introduce a cap on legal migration, as Giles was mentioning earlier, to get the number of legal migrants falling every year. Do you think this is a credible plan?
I think it would prove quite difficult. It's quite interesting. The government obviously is concerned about the level of migration. Level of migration is about to come down quite a long way. Anyway, I've just spent the morning at a migration conference to launch a big report on migration to the UK. Numbers are due to come down already. I mean, social care visa applications are falling off a cliff. That will raise other issues. I think the idea is that the Migration Advisory Committee would produce recommendations, then Parliament be asked to vote every year. Assume they must be asked to vote on the gross number because the government can't control how many people decide to leave. It'd be very interesting to see what number they would set, in how much detail would they set it? Would they set it for work, for students, for families? Quite what do you mean? But you can imagine that almost immediately, if you set a number and you started bumping up limits, you would be subject to massive lobbying, hard luck stories and things like that. So I think it's really, really interesting. Of course, one of the things that we've seen is that one of the reasons the OBR has managed to create a bit more headroom for the government to allow them to cut taxes in a few recent budgets is because they've upgraded the inward migration forecast. So there is a sort of direct feed through as well into the sort of fiscal room for manoeuvre. So it's really, really interesting to see where this goes and see whether it's enough for some of the Conservatives. The Prime Minister basically says, well, we won't be deterred by foreign courts from what we're doing, but he doesn't go quite as far as saying that the UK would pull out of the European Convention on Human Rights. And we're waiting to see, I think, whether there are some people in the Conservative Party who decide to either personally campaign on a harder pledge or indeed launch that as a bit of an alternative manifesto that I think is being trailed around this week as a possibility if this manifesto isn't enough to turn the polls round. So we'll have to wait to see where it goes. But at the moment, the Prime Minister actually is bringing down migration from very, very high levels by some of the measures he's already taken. It'd be very interesting to see whether how sustainable some of those are.
Okay, I've got a question I've got to ask from Olivia, who asks about a recent IfG report. So top marks to Olivia for reading one of our reports. Nick, this is a question for you. How preventative does this manifesto look to you? Where does it do well and where could it do better in terms of prevention?
So it does mention prevention in a few places. I know because I did the classic Control F search throughout to try and find some examples, but they are all very small scale kind of interventions. And one of the big messages from our report was that actually, to make a kind of big impact, it needs to be a much kind of wider reorientation of government towards prevention, because although a lot of governments since 2010 have kind of highlighted and promoted individual preventative initiatives, the overall trend has been for funding to be cut in preventative services or interventions, and for much more funding to go towards acute services. And the big kind of finding that we had was that actually, if you want to make that shift, then the key thing it requires is political will. You need a prime minister and a chancellor who are committed to it, and then you need to kind of implement changes to how you do spending reviews, to how you monitor performance, and the kind of the autonomy given to frontline services in order to implement that. And none of those things are present in this manifesto.
Thanks, Nick. Giles, I've got a question for you. This is another anonymous question. Do you think there is much in the manifesto for business or the city?
Well, I saw a commitment not to raise the corporation tax, which is quite good. They probably, I mean, and you know, raising the effective supply of labour is quite good. I think the legal migration cap might actually hurt, although it's just because it's really hard to get that right, and who knows where exactly it will bite. I haven't been able to look up their actual commitments on financial service reform. I mean, a lot of what I've seen them do is basically say, you know, we've started doing this, like the difficult mansion house reforms that are going to make the city a more attractive place, and we're going to continue with that. So, but otherwise, I did not very much. I mean, I like the fact that they're sticking with the industrial strategy sorts of things that they're doing, the catapults, the advanced manufacturing plan, but. Otherwise, it's just sort of business as usual. I think they're basically saying we've steadied the ship. We're not going to raise taxes. The conservative way is that then it's up to you to grow the economy.
Thanks, Giles. Nick, I've got an infrastructure question for you, also anonymous. If the government were to be re-elected, how would this affect current infrastructure planning and priorities?
A good question. So on public services, the manifesto reiterates the commitments that were made in the spring budget to kind of increase the capital budget in the NHS, mostly to invest in new technology to improve productivity. The other new thing in the manifesto for public service infrastructure that was trailed earlier in the week was that they would support the creation of 100 new GP practices and would renovate 150 more. I mean, I think on both of those, they don't really address the scale of the challenge. So, you know, more capital funding is welcome. And actually, NHS capital funding is currently relatively high by historical standards, but by historical standards, we have, as a country, consistently over decades invested less than other OECD countries. And there were particularly deep cuts over the 2010s, and that has, as one of the big causes of our productivity problems, a lot of public services are operating out of old, often quite literally crumbling buildings. Staff have to use outdated IT. They don't have as much kind of equipment like MRI scanners as those in other countries, which is why we haven't got the most out of new staff. And on GP practices, you know, we've also just released a report on this, And, you know, it's a big problem. A lot of the GP estate is very old. It's cramped. It's not designed for the kind of operation of multidisciplinary teams and the integration of different parts of the health and care services. But there are nearly 9,000 GP premises. So, you know, offering to build 100 more and renovate 150, it doesn't remotely touch the size of the issues that they're facing.
Thanks, Nick. Jill, I've got a question here which requires you to see into the mind of the Conservative Party from Anonymous. Why are there things in the manifesto that the party could have done in the last 5 years? For example, consulting on pavement parking 3 years ago, not doing anything, and then saying you'll ban it in this manifesto.
It's very interesting. I think any government always sort of sets off things and doesn't quite see them through because something else displaces that activity, and then you're looking around and saying, well, we thought this was a good idea once and maybe we'll put this in that. I mean, we've got some commitments to bring back some of the legislation that fell in wash up, you know, the tobacco and vapes bill. Interestingly, not the football regulator bill, though. Maybe that was which I thought was lost in wash up, but maybe I'm wrong on that, which was an interesting feature of the 2019 manifesto. So quite a lot of this, you know, throughout this, the government does have to answer the question. We were talking about tax avoidance, about, you know, why is this new? I mean, why have you not done these things before? So there's a bit of a sort of desperation on some of that. I mean, just on the parking thing, it is very interesting, some of the sort of, you know, interest groups the Prime Minister's decided to very much put the Conservatives behind. Drivers are very definitely one of them. There's a big bit about, you know, backing people on the journeys they have to make every day and putting the government on the side of drivers against, you know, annoying local councils who are introducing LTNs and things like that, so low traffic neighbourhoods. So there's that sort of thought. There's also, you know, this is also a sort of slightly sort of weird thing. There's a very big pitch, I think, to the sort of rural farming vote. There's a lot of assurances. One of the new things that I've not seen before, it's going very off track to this, is to legislate a food security target. I mean, which I'd never heard trailed before, maybe I'd missed it, but also lots of reassurances about putting farmers first in trade deals, something that was thought previous governments didn't do. We've seen that from former Agriculture Secretary George Eustace, and reassurance as well about the amount of money going into support farming, which will have the Treasury rather annoyed because they probably thought that was a budget that they could start raiding in the next spending round.
Okay, thanks, Jill. So I've got one final question I'd like you each to answer just quickly in 30 seconds before we wrap up. I hate it when chairs say that sort of thing to me, but here we go. And Giles, I think we'll start with you. So the question is, does this manifesto suggest a re-elected Conservative government led by a re-elected Rishi Sunak would approach a new term of government in a different way to his predecessors of the last 14 years?
I don't need 30 seconds. Absolutely not. I've never seen such a business as usual manifesto in my life.
Thanks, Nick.
Yeah, I mean, it's very much business as usual for the continuation of the Sunak government on public services, though it would be quite different to the Johnson government, which increased investment in quite a few public services, but there's not much sign of that in this manifesto.
Jill, has Rishi Sunak convinced you he is the change candidate?
Not from himself. I think he is a big change from Boris Johnson, but in terms of some of these sort of unfunded tax cut commitments, I think the risk is he looks a bit too much like Liz Truss.
As Nick Robinson was implying yesterday in the interview he did on BBC One. Okay, well, that is all we have time for today, but don't worry, we will be back at the same time on Thursday to see what Keir Starmer and the Labour Party have included in their manifesto and see how their proposals stack up. You can also see what the rest of our IfG experts think about today's announcements on our website with a new comment, 7 things we learned from the Conservative manifesto.